Foreshortening is hard. Wait, what is foreshortening? Is this foreshortening? No, this is foreshortening. But it's not quite right. That's better. But why? How do we draw foreshortening the right way? I'm Marc. I've been a professional artist since 2000 and something, and now I teach art for a living. In this week's YouTube Art School episode, we'll look at 5 mistakes that most artists make when they try to draw foreshortening. Foreshortening being the effect that gives our drawings an awesome sense of depth when done right. And you should be able to do it right after this class. Oh heck, it's starting! Alright, class is in session. Pay attention. Also, repairing my office due to the ongoing fire damage is getting expensive, so I'd appreciate if you paid the class fee of 1 like or 1 sub to help, whichever you can afford. Thank you. Now, let's see what might be contributing to your foreshortening looking flat or distorted. I'll go over 5 of the most frequent mistakes that I see art students make, and even more importantly, what you should be doing to fix those mistakes and get awesome results. If you want those easy art XP points, you'll want to keep watching. One of the first mistakes I'll see my students make, one that really takes the 4 out of foreshortening. Yeah, that makes no sense. Anyways, scale is usually going to be the first clue something is wrong. Just like when you take an up-close shot with a really short focal length, you know, with a camera. The subject will appear very distorted, but we understand. Things that are closer to the lens will look bigger compared to the stuff in the background. That's why we can look at this photo where the head is massive and the legs are tiny and think nothing of it. It looks normal. That's foreshortening. When you take a photo from far away with a long focal length though, everything looks flat. And I can recreate this in 3D here. The foreshortening effect is destroyed. So we always have to think about which part is closest to the lens, or the canvas in our case. I always think of the canvas as a camera lens that we're looking through. Objects that are closer should appear to be bigger, and those far away should be smaller in comparison. This drawing shows bad foreshortening because despite being in perspective, the parts that seem closer to us are no larger than the rest. It looks flat. When we adjust the scale properly though, looks much better. Always keep scale in mind. The second foreshortening mistake I see all the time is a loss of correct proportions when artists try to incorporate foreshortening in their art, aka broken proportions. This is arguably the hardest part about foreshortening. In this case, here, the drawing respects the scale, right? It's bigger, so we understand that it's closer to us, but the arm seems way too long. As a simple general rule, the more foreshortened something is, the shorter it'll appear to be. It's in the name. If the same arm is not foreshortened at all, it'll be at its longest and it'll just appear progressively shorter as the foreshortening effect increases. You can think of it this way. If the object is halfway pointing at us, it should appear to be about half its normal length. Another proportion-related issue I'll often see is this: failing to properly identify the center of a foreshortened object. This time around, you could be drawing windows on a building facade or trying to figure out where to position the knee on a leg seen foreshortened. Your first instinct might be to divide this in half and place the windows on both sides, but that would be wrong. This is not the center. To find it, trace a straight line from each opposite corner and X marks the spot. You can use this in many different scenarios. Now, if we use this as the center, the windows will seem properly foreshortened and the perspective will be much more convincing. Good foreshortening is really a display of good fundamentals, and if you need help with that, by the way, if you've always wanted to be able to draw whatever your mind can imagine, that's what I guarantee students when they join my art program, Art School for Digital Artists. It's about 100 hours of classes similar in content to what you'd find in a Bachelor of Fine Arts, but with a heavy focus on digital arts instead, and you get to go at your own pace. Check the coupon code in the video description for a huge discount valid until the end of the month before the price of the program goes up. You'll find the link to learn more down there as well. Don't miss out! Now, the third foreshortening mistake is to skip the construction phase in your drawing. What is construction, you ask? Well, everything we see can be deconstructed into simpler shapes, simpler volumes. The drawing process is much easier when you start with those simple volumes and then focus on the details. That's construction. Especially important when foreshortening is concerned. But really, construction is always important. It's so easy to get lost in form and details when you don't construct your drawing first. Looking at this, it might not be super obvious what exactly is wrong, but if this had been constructed properly first, as in if the first pass of the drawing had been simple volumes like these instead, it would have been much easier to spot the mistakes and correct them before you move on to details. With the right construction, we can then add the details back on and the final result should hold up much better. If you want to practice this, you should go watch the Learn to Draw in 30 Days video that I released about 2 weeks ago. I'll link this in the top right corner of the screen. It should definitely help. Always use construction in your drawing process. You must. Now, the fourth foreshortening mistake is not to use a bounding box. This is kind of similar to construction, but not quite. Instead, it holds the construction. Everything I've mentioned so far is much easier when you use the bounding box for your subjects. Could be a prop or a character. The idea is to draw your construction within that bigger bounding box, like a container for it. This is especially useful when you're trying to draw your character as part of a bigger environment where you want the perspective to match. Way too often, characters and props will seem like they're floating in space relative to one another instead of being firmly planted on the ground. Before you add any detail, before you start working on the construction, start with one or multiple bounding boxes to block out your scene. Then if needed, you can always split those boxes in equal sections like we saw at the beginning of the class to help measure proportions accurately. Big brain stuff. Use a bounding box. And then finally, the last foreshortening mistake is to ignore aesthetic balance. Specifically talking about character poses here. It's one thing to draw correct foreshortening. It's another story to make sure it looks good. Often you'll see stuff like this where, technically speaking, the foreshortening works, but the pose will look stiff and it creates an arguably boring silhouette. I always like to judge silhouettes. You should almost always be able to tell the pose from the black silhouette alone. If not, chances are the pose sucks. When you think you're done with your drawing, turn it into a black silhouette and see if it still reads just as well. Looking at this one, is this even a character? By adjusting the pose a bit to something like this though, same perspective, same proportions, same level of foreshortening, but the end result is a lot more appealing. Let's see if that passes the silhouette test. Oh yes, it sure does. So remember, just because a pose is technically correct doesn't mean it's aesthetically good. Choose your references accordingly and always think of this stuff when drawing. And oh snap, quick bonus round. One more thing that can easily kill the effect of foreshortening in your drawings is bad line weight. When drawing, use bolder, thicker lines for anything that's meant to be closer and progressively thinner lines as details get further and further away from the viewer. Same logic as when we change the scale. If we change the scale of the body parts, the scale of the lines should follow along. You can see this effect applied here if we take a last look at our foreshortened man. Bolder lines in the front, thinner lines in the back. And well, that's gonna wrap it up for this week's class. I hope it helps. If not, then maybe my free brush set will. You can go and grab it with the link in the video description. I use these brushes every day for the majority of the drawings you've seen today. They might be free, but that doesn't mean that they're not awesome, because they are. They're some of my favorites. Use them responsibly. And well, that's gonna be it for this week's class. Make sure you hit the bell if you haven't already to be on time for next week's class. And in the meantime, check out these other classes that I'm sure you'll like as well. I'll see you in the next one. Oh.